You remember the drill, the bell, not the fire bell, the other one. The one with the different cadence that every child in every school in America learned to distinguish from every other bell, and the specific quality of your teacher's voice when she said it, not the voice she used for reading or arithmetic. The other voice, the one that meant this was different. The sound of 20 wooden chair legs scraping simultaneously against linoleum, the specific darkness under the desk, the particular smell of floor wax and chalk dust, and the feeling of your own forearms pressed over the back of your neck in the position you had been shown. You held that position for as long as she told you to, and you did not ask why, and she did not offer. Children in America did this hundreds of times across the 1950s and 1960s, in schools from Maine to California, and not one of them was ever given a complete answer to the question the drill was actually answering. Here is what the government's 1951 manual said would really happen. And here is what your teacher knew that she was never authorized to tell you. The Duck and Cover campaign was launched in 1951 by the Federal Civil Defense Administration, 18 months after the Soviet Union successfully tested its first nuclear weapon in August 1949. The FCDA had a problem that had no clean solution. American children were spending their days in school buildings with no blast protection, no underground shelter, and no meaningful structural shielding from a nuclear detonation. The agency could not build bomb shelters under every school in the country. It could not guarantee that any warning would come in time to evacuate. What it could do, what it chose to do, was teach children to use the one resource that was universally available, the distance between their bodies and the nearest glass, the nearest falling debris, the nearest source of thermal flash. The duck and cover drill was not a fantasy. It was a second-best solution to a problem that had no first-best answer. The campaign produced a film. In 1951, the FCDA commissioned Archer Productions to create an animated short featuring a turtle named Bert. The film showed Bert retreating into his shell when danger approached, a visual metaphor for the drill's core principle. The film was distributed to schools across the country and shown to children in auditoriums and classrooms throughout the 1950s. By the end of the decade, virtually every American child had seen it. What most people do not know is that Bert the Turtle was only the public face of a far more detailed program. Behind the film was a teacher's manual, a principal's protocol guide, and a set of instructions for school administrators that explained, in terms the animated film deliberately did not exactly what the drill was preparing for. The film told children to duck and cover. The manual told teachers what to do next. The two documents described different realities, and the children were only shown one of them. The 1951 FCDA Survival Manual for Schools differentiated between two scenarios that the animated film collapsed into one. The first scenario was a detonation far enough away that the primary immediate threat to children in a school building was not the blast itself, but the thermal flash, the intense burst of radiant heat and light that travels at the speed of light, arriving before any sound, before any pressure wave, before any of the physical effects that most people associate with a nuclear explosion. At distances of several miles from a kiloton-range atomic detonation, the thermal flash could cause severe burns on exposed skin and permanent eye damage from the reflected light alone. getting under a desk and covering exposed skin was genuinely protective against this specific threat. It was not sufficient protection against everything, but it was real protection, measurable in documented outcomes from the 1945 survivors in Japan who showed that fabric and physical barriers provided meaningful reduction in flash burn severity, even at distances that would have seemed intuitively close to the blast. The manual said this clearly. Your teacher knew this. She was not teaching the children a lie. She was teaching them the true part of a story that had other parts she was not permitted to tell. The second scenario in the 1951 manual was a detonation close enough that structural collapse was likely. For this scenario, the manual's guidance was different and far more specific than anything the animated film suggested. Children near windows were to move immediately to interior walls. Children in upper floors were to descend to ground level if time permitted. The basement, if the school had one, was the primary survival space. Some schools had designated survival rooms identified by their structural mass and distance from exterior walls. The duck and cover position in this scenario was not the end of the protocol. It was the first 3 seconds of a longer sequence that most teachers had been trained to execute and most children had never been shown. What the manual did not include, what no official civil defense document ever said to a child, was an honest description of what a nuclear detonation at close range would actually produce. The FCDA had made a deliberate decision, documented in internal communications from 1950 and 1951, that the psychological impact of full disclosure on children was an unacceptable risk. They had consulted with child psychologists who advised that children who understood the full scope of nuclear consequences would not be calmer or better prepared. They would be traumatized and unable to function in the normal activities of a school day, which was itself considered a national security asset. The drill was designed to give children a sense of agency and a physical response they could execute. It was designed explicitly not to explain what they were responding to. Your teacher understood both sides of this. She had read the manual. She had attended the in-service training held at the county level, where the fuller picture was presented to educators in language that was never put in front of their students. She taught the drill because she had been told to, and because the alternative, telling a 7-year-old what a nuclear weapon actually does to a building, to a street, to a city block, was not something any teacher in any school in America had been authorized or equipped to do. In 1952, 1 year after the Duck and Cover campaign launched in schools across America, the United States tested its first thermonuclear weapon. The yield was 10.4 megatons, approximately 700 times the yield of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The calculation behind the 1951 manual had been built on atomic weapons with yields measured in kilotons. The thermonuclear weapon changed every number in that calculation. The survivable distance expanded. The blast radius expanded. The thermal flash radius expanded. Everything the manual had said was real remained real. But it was now true only at distances that, for most American cities and their surrounding suburbs, placed the school building outside the damage zone entirely, or inside a zone where no desk provided meaningful protection regardless of position. The FCDA knew this. The shift from atomic to thermonuclear weapons was not a secret. It was front-page news. What the agency chose to do with this knowledge, or more precisely, what it chose not to do, is the part of the duck and cover story that has never been fully told. The drills continued. New versions of the Bert the Turtle film were distributed, the manuals were updated in language and graphic design without being updated in fundamental premise. The duck and cover position remained the centerpiece of school civil defense instruction through the late 1950s and into the 1960s, even as the weapons it was designed to respond to had rendered its core calculation obsolete for anyone living within a meaningful distance of a potential target. Your teacher continued to call the drill. She may not have known the precise yield calculations that had changed the survivable distances. Or she may have known and continued anyway, because the alternative, stopping the drills, admitting publicly that they were inadequate, explaining to a gymnasium full of second graders why the procedure they had practiced for years was no longer what the government believed would actually help them, was a conversation that no school, no district, no government agency was prepared to have with the children of America. By the time the Cuban Missile Crisis arrived in October 1962, the children sitting under their desks in American schools were performing a ritual whose original function had quietly outpaced its original design. But the ritual had acquired a different function by then. It was not purely physical preparation. It was an acknowledgement, conducted in the specific language of children and teachers in a classroom, that the danger existed, that it was real, that it was close enough that the adults in the building had a procedure for it. Some teachers, during those 13 days of October 1962, conducted the drill with an intensity that had not been present before. Some conducted it with a deliberate calmness that was its own form of communication. Some of the children who crouched under their desks in October 1962 understood, in the way that children understand things they have not been told directly, that this particular drill was different from the ones before it. The drills began to fade in the mid-1960s. There was no single announcement, no official discontinuation, no document distributed to school principals across the country declaring the duck and cover era over. The FCDA had been absorbed into the Office of Civil Defense in 1958. Civil defense philosophy was shifting away from shelter-in-place toward evacuation and population dispersal. The Crisis Relocation Plan that would define civil defense thinking in the late 1960s and 1970s. The cultural mood around nuclear war was changing in ways that made the animated turtle feel increasingly out of step with what Americans understood about the weapons that existed now. The drills became less frequent across the country, first in urban districts, then in suburbs, then in the rural schools that had always been slightly behind the national pace. Then they were gone. No ceremony, no explanation, no final bell. The last generation of American children to practice duck and cover in school graduated and went on with their lives. They became parents who did not teach their children the drill because nobody had ever fully explained it to them, and they had no framework for passing on a procedure whose purpose had never been openly stated. They became grandparents who, if asked about it now, remember the specific darkness under the desk, the chalk dust smell, the linoleum, the forearms pressed over the neck, with a clarity that 60 years has not softened. What your generation carried out of those classrooms was not the drill itself. The drill was a procedure and procedures fade with time and disuse. What your generation carried out was something else. The specific understanding, absorbed before the age of 10 in the most formative possible years, that the world you were growing up in contained a danger large enough that the adults around you had developed a physical response to it and were teaching that response to children as a matter of routine. That understanding shaped a generation's relationship to preparedness in ways that are still visible today. The people who stood in grocery store lines on October 23, 1962, had learned something under a school desk in 1954 that no pamphlet had explicitly taught them. They had learned that preparation was not pessimism, that having a procedure for an unthinkable thing was not the same as believing the unthinkable would happen, that the specific posture of readiness, arms over the back of the neck, body low, eyes away from the windows, was not surrender to fear. It was the most human possible answer to a question that an entire civilization had never been asked before and did not know how to answer in any other way. Your teacher taught you that. She taught it within the limits of what she was permitted to say, and she taught it every time she called that drill, in the full knowledge of what she was not allowed to tell you.